Hey, I'm Megan, and this is a conversation for Youth Culture 2025. I'm joined today by Justin Brierley, who you may recognise from last year's New Day event, as he is being interviewed on Night 2 about what he is seeing happen among the emerging generation in this nation. Justin is a writer, speaker, and broadcaster who is best known for his conversations around faith, science, theology, and culture with both Christian thinkers and secular thinkers. He has worked in radio, podcasting, and video for 2 decades, and his latest book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, published in 2023, is partnered with his documentary podcast series under the same name. Justin is married to Lucy, a church minister in Surrey, which is where we are today, and together they have 4 children. Outside of his professional work, Justin serves his local church through youth work and leading worship. Very good. Well, yes, you have mentioned about what you're seeing across this nation, this spiritual landscape. I would love to ask you, I also know that you've just been away with some youth workers, British...
Youth for Christ.
That's right. The one.
Yeah. It was a real privilege to be asked to sort of join, about 200 youth workers at their sort of annual get-together at the beginning of the year. And I was leading some Bible studies each morning and talking about this idea of the surprising rebirth of belief in God. And it was just delightful to hear lots of their stories of this kind of new openness that they're sensing as well among a lot of young people, among students, and to hear some of those stories, of what God's doing at the moment.
Do you have any stories that you can share
I mean,
with us?
a lot of them were just talking about just this sense that actually there's a kind of real spiritual hunger and thirst among a lot of young people. And we could go into some of the reasons for that later. But there were stories, for instance, of just 4 young guys just suddenly turning up in church out of the blue. No one had really invited them. They just walked through the doors, sat at the back, and they've all become Christians. And it's sort of like, this is quite unusual. Doesn't happen every day, obviously, when that kind of thing happens. A conversation I had a little while ago with someone who works across universities with students all over the country said that they've seen a real uptick in the number of students just showing a genuine interest in Christianity. So Fusion, the organization who work across all these campuses, said they did some research to see whether what they were getting anecdotally seemed to make sense statistically. And they found that of the non-Christian students they surveyed with the question, if someone invited you to church, would you say yes? 75% said, yes, I would. They've never seen that kind of response before. And it tallies with this kind of, as I say, this new openness that they're seeing among a lot of the student body. I mean, one story that someone told me was of someone spotting, a Christian student spotting someone else on campus with a T-shirt that just said Matthew 12 on it. And they go up to this person who they weren't aware was a Christian or whatever. And they said, oh, I see you've got Matthew 12 on your T-shirt. Do you read the Bible? Are you a Christian? He's like, well, I've just started reading the Bible and I really like this chapter. So I put it on a T-shirt.
Oh.
And he said, but I'm not really Christian. I've never been to church. And this was just someone who'd literally just bought a Bible, started reading it. And so they went to church. And it's those kinds of stories, just people almost out of the blue who seem to be on a journey, who seem to be picking up a Bible, seem to be finding their way into a church. They just seem to be on the increase at the moment.
So encouraging. I love that. Thanks for sharing. Why do you think this is happening? Like what factors do you think are leading to this openness, to people just reading the Bible, picking the Bible up, for 4 people coming through the door? What do you think is leading to that?
It's really interesting because on the one hand, when you look at Gen Z, I think that's sort of 1997 to 2012, people who were born within that era, they're sort of the least church generation, the generation you're least likely to find in church. And, until recently, in many parts of the US and the UK and parts of the West, they're the most likely to describe themselves as having no religious affiliation. So on the one hand, you could say, oh, this looks like a very non-religious bunch of people. But the interesting thing is the researchers are also showing us that they're the most spiritually open generation as well. And so even though you're not very likely at the moment to find them in church, you're very likely to find them being very open to some kind of form of spirituality. So if you go on TikTok, you're going to find people talking about manifesting, talking about crystals. You're going to find like the witch talk phenomenon, where young women are trying to kind of control their environment and other people through charms and hexes and things like that. So there's all these weird and wonderful manifestations of spirituality. And the question is, well, what does that mean for the church, for Christians? What I think it shows is that the religious instinct has always been there and always will be there. And a lot of sort of what I've been looking at through this surprising rebirth phenomenon is the way that a certain sort of group of people who were really sort of said the future is just based in science and reason, tried to kind of stamp out the religious instinct in people and say, we need to get rid of that. You know, that's just superstition, fairy tales and so on. These were the so-called new atheists of, say, the mid-2000s. And they became very popular, especially with a lot of young people, actually. But I think what happened is that story that they told just didn't satisfy. People found that actually their ultimate questions around meaning and purpose and identity just weren't answered by just science and reason. Those are good for some things, but they don't kind of offer you ultimately a kind of meaningful existence. And so what I think has happened is that into that void, if you like, because they weren't given any answers, young people are kind of still looking. They're still fundamentally religious. It's just they've got hold of all these other stories. And the reason for that is because the Christian story, of course, over the last century or more, has kind of gradually faded more and more into the background. And so when people think of spirituality, they often don't think of Christianity because that's sort of fuddy-duddy, old, irrelevant sort of thing. But what's interesting is that there's still this real desire for something spiritual, the sort of spiritual but not religious kind of crowd and so on. And the question is, well, how's that working out?
Yeah.
And the problem is, I think, that a lot of these new quasi-religious forms of spirituality just aren't really working out for a lot of young people. They're seeking, but they're not finding in all of these places. And I think there is this new opportunity for the church as we see this new kind of openness to spirituality, but which isn't always finding the answers to its longings and it's this quest to say, actually, there's this story you might want to reconsider, this story about a God who loves you, who made you, who created you for a purpose, who came in person to give himself for you, and who offers this extraordinary gift of forgiveness and life eternal. I think this is a moment when young people are suddenly ready to hear that message again.
It's so good. And it's Jesus. That's what it's about. And you can see that there is a hunger for, amongst this emerging generation for Jesus. And you're saying about the kind of spirituality. We kind of see a lot of churches that are quite religious still in their formats, their service formats, and even just in the way that the organizations are working. I know that you've spoken recently on podcasts about kind of keeping Christianity weird, as you say. What can the church be doing to kind of capitalize, lean in to this spiritual hunger that people are having?
Yeah. Well, I think at the root, as I say, of this hunger is a kind of a search for a story to make sense of life in that sense. And the problem is, as I say, is that as we lost the Christian story, all these other stories have come into its place. And especially among young people, those may be stories around sexuality, gender, identity, kind of the things on the more progressive side, or, it might be even sort of political mythologies on the right. Something's going to take the place of the God story, if you like. And as I say, the problem is that I don't think those stories ultimately satisfy people because they bash up against each other and create the culture wars that we're living through. And actually, the kind of this burden that I think has now been put on young people, especially through the rise of social media and technology, to kind of constantly invent themselves and kind of find a fresh identity constantly is actually exhausting for young people. And it's leading, I think it's part of the reason why we're seeing a mental health crisis among young people, because they're looking for a sense of stability and identity, but they're so ephemeral and everything's changing so quickly. And it's also confusing that I think it leads to a kind of paralysis and this anxiety because we never find the story that's supposed to make sense of our life. And so I think the church has to come along and say, with confidence now, there is a story that makes sense of your life.
It's good.
And the problem sometimes has been that the church has kind of tried to play too much by the rules that the culture has given it. So, as I say, if you go back some years to the heyday of these new atheists, these very scientific rationalist kind of people who had their objections to Christianity, they were leveling, objections to God and faith. And the church inevitably felt, and I was part of this, the need to offer responses and to give kind of rational justifications for belief in God. And there's an important place for that. But the problem is, if the church kind of just focuses on that and thinks that that's what we need to do, just give people kind of these rational explanations for why they should believe in God, we might be missing the fact that the conversation's moved on. And actually today, young people are not so concerned necessarily about being given a philosophical argument for God. They've got these questions about identity. How do I make sense of who I am? Give me a reason to get out of bed in the morning. What do I do with my anxiety? And I think that's where the church now needs to be leaning in, because those are actually the kinds of concerns and questions that young people have. And I think one of the best ways to do that is to tell that story confidently again, imaginatively, creatively.
It's good.
Because people need a story to live by. And the story of Christianity is, in a way, the only story that will ultimately answer those questions. Different churches are going to do that in a variety of different ways. I think we can do it through art, through music, through creative forms of evangelism. But one of the significant ways in which I think it's become apparent that people are attracted to church is when it does look quite different to the story they're already getting in the culture. And this is where I've been using a phrase that a lot of people have picked up on recently, which is keep Christianity weird. And it's this idea that actually one of the reasons why people generally, but young people too, are attracted to church possibly is because it feels and looks quite different to what they're already getting in the culture. I mean, if you go to church and all you get is a kind of warmed over version of what you're already hearing in the culture about kind of some moralistic platitudes and about, some sort of social justice issues. And I don't know, if it just looks and feels the same, you're going to, inevitably someone's going to ask, well, why do I need to come here to hear this when I've already got it there? And the church to some extent kind of becomes invisible. But when it does actually major on its weirdness, and that's the weirdness of the fact it believes in the supernatural, that God can heal you, that there is a demonic realm, that actually there's a spiritual battle going on in each of us every day, that God can manifest in all kinds of interesting, unusual ways. That, while sometimes I think Christians can be a bit embarrassed and almost want to hide that stuff because it feels like, that's going to be off-putting, it's going to be strange, it's going to be weird. I think now, actually, it's something that's actually quite attractive to people because it is so different to what they're being told and what they receive in the kind of public square. Likewise, the kind of ethical demands of Christianity, the challenge of what we do with our money, what we do with our life, what we do with our sexuality, all of that, again, has often been kind of soft pedaled because we're a bit worried about putting people off. It's going to be rather demanding. But I think actually what's become clear is that especially young people, they're looking for a challenge, actually. They're looking for something real. And actually, in a surprising way, it's very often the churches that sort of roll back on those kinds of issues the most that are hemorrhaging young people the most because they've got nothing to offer. Whereas the churches that are saying, actually, come here and it's going to be tough. It's going to be a kind of a challenge. I think they're actually seeing a lot more fruit because young people kind of are ready for that. I think they've been I think because what they're experiencing in the culture at the moment, these other stories just aren't working for them. It's almost created a desperation, a sort of hunger, a thirst that's now ready for the real meat of Christianity and to say, I want something that feels real, that feels like a challenge, that isn't just mediated through my phone and digital stuff. Church is one of the few places where you still get to do life together with other human beings face to face. And I can't understate just how that important that is, I think now, because I think young people are so I think that the anxiety, the mental health crisis is so much a result of the fact that we now do everything through digital devices and everything else. It's like a tonic actually coming and doing real life with real people. And church is the best place to do that because it's a place where we are all in the same boat. We absolutely understand that we're all in need of grace. We're all failures. We're all sinners, but we gather around this person who is bigger than any of our failures and who gives us this extraordinary grace. And we hand that grace out to everyone around us. That's so different to the culture that we live in, which is very censorious, religious in all the wrong ways. You know, we have this cancel culture. If you don't think the same as me, if you don't have the right ideas, I'll demonize you. I think all of that is leading to this sort of, this overburdened sense of anxiety, fear, and exhaustion among young people. And when they encounter something that's completely different to that in church, I think it's extraordinary how much you'll see people just suddenly light up and realize this was what I was looking for all along.
I love that. It's so encouraging. I think making space for it is so important. And, you know, we live in such a almost like passive world where, like, you know, I'll be looking at my phone and there'll be stuff coming up in the news and it's like, it's just literally going over my head because we're exposed to so much. And I think definitely making the most of, like, actually we aren't a cold environment. Like, the church is alive. The gospel is alive. And so let's be alive and let's lean into that. It's great. Kind of zooming a bit more into youth and youth groups. And we've spoken about the church as a whole, but what can youth workers and what can people working with young people be doing to help these people as they search more?
I just think that there is a bit of a disconnect at the moment between a lot of the exciting stuff that's happening and whether you're seeing that translate into kind of young people coming into church or getting involved. It's really interesting, isn't it, that one of the key things that I think is representative of this bubbling up of this spiritual hunger and thirst was represented in what many people have called the Asbury Awakening of a couple of years ago. And this was just an example of a kind of regular sort of weekday worship service, prayer service at this university in America. And the young people, the students who were leading it, just kind of decided to stay on. They just felt God saying, let's stay on. And they just started to pour out their hearts, confess their sin to each other. And suddenly this thing just grew and grew, and it turned into this sort of 2 or 3 week long revival. You know, some people have said, well, it's an awakening, an outpouring, whatever word you want to use. Something happened and it started to draw people from lots of other places. And there was just a real sense from everyone I've spoken to who went there that something in the atmosphere had changed. And there was just this absolute expectation and desperation for God. And what was interesting about the Asbury Awakening for me was that it was absolutely led by Gen Z students. It was not hijacked by any particular ministry or any Christian celebrities. It wasn't hyped in that sense. It was very simple. The worship was not some kind of extravaganza. It was just, you know, maybe someone on a guitar, someone on a piano. It was sort of genuinely, just something so simple and pure in a sense. And I think that the leadership of that very consciously wanted to keep it that way as well. And I think that was what was so different about it. It felt real. I think Gen Z, young people, they can smell something that's insincere or fabricated from a mile off. And I think the thing about what happened there is that it felt real. And God suddenly moved in all kinds of amazing ways. And as I understand it, that movement has kind of ignited fires elsewhere across the US. There's actually at the moment an extraordinary kind of awakening happening across lots of campuses now in the US. And lots of people there saying same thing. It's led by young people. It's very real. It's not kind of jazzed up. It's not smoke machines and lights. It's just people getting on their knees, confessing their sins to each other, and God's doing amazing things. And the question is, like, well, what do we learn? Like, it's happening on these campuses, and then you're seeing it happen in the UK as well, we're seeing the first signs of some of these awakening movements happening, as I say, in some of these student populations and among some churches as well. I think the problem sometimes is that the church sees a move of God or something happening in the Spirit and kind of wants to sort of put it in a structure immediately. And that can often sometimes squeeze the life out of these things. Because obviously there is a structure we have to church, and there are programs we have, and there are things we need to do. But sometimes it's about having the flexibility to just let God do God's thing, and I would love to see maybe some of our church leaders just going to some of these campus awakenings and going to some of these student bodies and seeing what's happening there, and just asking, well, how do we create that kind of openness in our worship, how do we invite that kind of real stuff to happen? Because very often, like it or not, our church services can become kind of almost overproduced and over sort of regimented down to the last second, and I love the fact that there's a commitment to excellence and production and everything else, but sometimes you kind of got to give space for God to just do things that are not necessarily scheduled, and that's what I think we're seeing. And I think that's what these young people are looking for. They're kind of, you can never compete in terms of your Sunday morning production with what young people can get easily from a concert, from their social media. Yeah. They have like the most extraordinary stuff just sitting in their pocket now. You can't really impress them any more than the secular world is able to. Yeah. What they don't have is the real power of God happening there and then. And that, I think, is what we need to do. We need to just give the Spirit space again to say, leave it to me, guys, okay? You don't have to, create this big atmosphere. Something's going to happen if you just give me the space to work. And so that's my kind of encouragement to church leaders is maybe to just look at what's happening and ask, what if we gave God the space to do that in our context? And given that there are this kind of, from the research that's been done, extraordinary numbers of young people on your doorstep, probably, if you live in a university town, on your doorstep, there's about, apparently 75% of the students going to that university would say yes to coming to your church if someone asked them. Could we get the confidence to go and just start inviting people again to church and see what happens? It could be, you could be quite surprised at what happens.
Come on. Yeah. I particularly just love what you're saying about making it real. I was leading worship at a youth at night one time, and I was at the keyboard, and the keyboard wasn't working. And we tried, and the keyboard just would not work. And I ended up just singing. And I was so blown away. Like, the mic wasn't even working either. I was so blown away by just the room of this 15 to 18-year-olds that were just singing out, harmonizing with each other, praying out. And I was like, it doesn't even need a keyboard and a microphone, and they're just going for it. And I was so encouraged by it. So I think, you're on it. I
mean, the day of Pentecost happened, and they had never heard of an AV desk or anything, It's true. It's amazing, isn't it?
It's great. You've spoken about kind of like a message of hope, but I just wanted to say, like, if you had one thing you could say to a room full of youth workers, parents, teachers, people working with young people, what's the one thing that you'd want to say?
I'd want to say, have hope, because I've been around myself, the church, long enough to know that there's a lot of negativity, there's a lot of cynicism. People who've been around the block, who've heard talk of revival maybe for years and never really seen a real sign of it in their own lives or church. I grew up in a church that often talked about revival, and I want for and long for revival. I just wonder if we're maybe approaching a moment when the conditions actually seem to be right. Sometimes a culture has to get so desperate for something for God to move. And I've used this image a lot in my book and podcast series of a tide of faith. And there's this famous poem about them, and it includes this line, the melancholy, long withdrawing roar of the sea of faith. 150 years ago, this poet talked about the sea of faith going out. And lots of people have said, well, that's the story, isn't it? Faith's gone out, on the West, in our world, we're not going to see it come back. Well, I think actually the whole point of the sea is that it does come back in again. That's the point of tides. And we are seeing, I think, the turning of the tide right now in some of these things we've talked about, especially among this renewal of and this awakening of interest in God and faith and spirituality among Gen Z. I think that's a sign that the tide is turning. So my advice is to keep holding out, keep praying, keep believing that God is a God of surprises. And every generation, I think, has to learn to be surprised by God again. And for me, I think we're at that moment, that turning of the tide moment. So just be expectant, keep praying faithfully. You maybe kind of have been working for years and years with young people and just sort of developed a sense of, the things I've prayed for, the things I've tried for, just haven't materialized. It often looks like that. It can look like that for long periods of time before suddenly something breaks and suddenly Aslan is on the move. God is doing something. And that's just my hope for every parent, youth worker, person working alongside children and young people is to just keep the faith, keep praying, and just expect God to do something surprising.
That's great. It's beautiful. Thank you so much. Thanks for joining us today to have this conversation.